CSS Grid is a two-dimensional layout system for the web that allows developers to create complex and responsive designs using rows and columns. It was developed to make it easier to create grid-based layouts, especially for complex and dynamic ones, without having to rely on hacky solutions like floats or table-based layouts. With CSS Grid, you define a grid container and then place grid items within it. You can control the size, position, and behavior of these grid items using a variety of CSS properties. You can also nest grids within grids to create even more complex designs. Some of the key benefits of using CSS Grid include improved readability and maintainability of code, better control over layout, especially for responsive designs, more efficient use of space on the page, ability to create complex and dynamic layouts with ease. If you're interested in learning more about CSS Grid, I would recommend starting with some tutorials and guides to get a better understanding of its syntax and concepts. There are many resources available online that can help you get started. In this example, the container class is the grid container, and the item class is used for the grid items. The grid template columns property is used to define the number of columns in the grid and their size. In this case, 3 equal width columns, repeat, 3, 1 per. The grid gap property is used to set the size of the gap between the grid items. You can see that the grid items are automatically placed in the grid based on their order in the HTML. The items are placed in rows from left to right and from top to bottom, filling up each row before moving on to the next one. This is just a simple example to demonstrate the basic concepts of CSS Grid. You can do much more with it, including controlling the size and position of individual grid items, creating nested grids, and using grid lines for precise placement of items. The syntax of CSS Grid can be broken down into several key components. Grid container, the parent element that contains the grid items. To create a grid container, you set the display property to grid. Grid items, the child elements of the grid container that make up the cells of the grid. Grid lines, the lines that define the rows and columns of the grid. There are horizontal grid lines that define the rows and vertical grid lines that define the columns. Grid template, the structure of the grid, including the number of rows and columns, their size, and the placement of the grid items. You define the grid template using the grid template rows and grid template columns properties. Grid areas, named sections within the grid that can be assigned to grid items. You can use grid areas to group items together and control their placement in the grid. Grid cell, the individual intersection of a row and a column. Grid items occupy one or more grid cells. Grid track, the space between two adjacent grid lines. There are row tracks and column tracks.